Welcome to this bonus video diary. This is like a video diary that we could never show while the film was being made because it's got too much interesting stuff in it, but it's the anatomy of a part of the T-Rex fight. Now, anybody who's familiar with the 1933 King Kong will be very much aware of the scene where Kong and the Tyrannosaurus fight, and as far as animation goes, it's really a milestone of choreography, the way that Willis O'Brien and his animators choreographed this wonderful wrestling match between this giant reptile and Kong. And it was obviously a sequence that we wanted to include in our version of King Kong. Ever since we first conceived the movie in 1996, we've had this idea that Kong ultimately fights a family of tyrannosaurs, 3 of them, and the fight escalates and gets bigger and bigger. I wanted the fight to not be stuck in one place. I wanted it to be this, like a brawl that goes out of control and rampages through the jungles and the rocks and terrain of Skull Island. So it started out initially with conceptual art. Jeremy Bennett and Gus Hunter did some very early designs. And there was one in particular that I responded to that had Kong and the T-Rex falling over the edge of a cliff and getting tangled in vines.
Given sort of quite a detailed brief, I guess, by Peter as to what he imagined that environment to look and feel like. It was 2 pieces of rock that jutted together that opened up at both ends, so you had sort of bottleneck, I guess, environment that was quite spacious at either end and bright, which would be quite handy in backlighting or certainly illuminating the CG characters. You know, we wanted it to be pretty lush and damp and mossy and vine-laden.
What he wanted us to do was to create Skull Island so that it looked just like the 1933 film, but that we were just there with better cameras.
Sequences like this have to have a strange balance of reality and stylization. You're always wanting the visual effects to be as real as possible, but on the other hand, I want Skull Island to be unreal in a fantasy kind of way. I wanted the island to be more jagged and more monsters and more amazing scenery than what you could ever find anywhere. So you're not actually trying to match a realistic environment, you're trying to create a heightened, over-the-top, fantastical landscape. And from that point, the animation department become involved, because what I love doing are animatics, which are like moving storyboards, which is basically a piece of computer animation that's quite crudely done, but it does allow you to first of all choreograph the fight and then to actually plan the camera angles that you're going to use. So we tend to just animate what I call an eye of God point of view, which is just simply a wide camera angle and you see the little figures moving around, and all you're simply doing is looking at the choreography. You're looking at the timing, the fight moves.
Our role for the vines was basically working with Peter and designing all the set pieces, all the action.
So it's Colin and 2 T-Rexes and Anne, and they're all separate. And we play up the whole Anne pendulum thing, like she's swinging and one of the T-Rexes is trying to grab it. Yeah.
We had a lot of freedom at the beginning of the process to just make stuff up ourselves. It's like you have a sort of a toy kit. It's like, here's Kong, you've got 3 T-Rexes, you got the vines, go and have a play.
They devised this wonderful sequence where a T-Rex falls off the ledge, dragging Kong down with him, and then there's this really quite intricate and complicated sequence that happens in these vines that are strung between the 2 sides of this chasm.
I mean, it did turn from, you know, Kong fighting a Rex in the vines to Kong losing Anne in the vines, her dangling on a vine above a Rex, the pendulum kind of action of her swinging and the Rex swinging and trying to snap and all these close calls with her, and then the Rex about to get her, Kong grabbing the Rex and them all falling together, and then her hanging off the Rex's teeth above another Rex, and all that stuff. And it just, it's just sort of, the way Pete designed sequences, just up and up and up and up and up the stakes.
We would start to cover the piece of choreography from many, many different camera angles. Those camera angles would sometimes run for 1 minute or 2 minutes, just following characters all the way down. And all of this footage becomes your raw material that you use to then put it into the Avid or the editing machine, and you cut the scene together.
So we get all this footage, and it's actually long takes of every different angle that you could possibly want. So you end up with huge amounts of footage.
We would look at what was the best bits with Peter, and Peter would decide what angle he wanted to be on at any time. And just like cutting live action, you get a scene and you cover it from many different angles.
Really, in a way, it's like cutting real footage, because it's been animated so well that we can actually make a really interesting scene out of it all.
And then we had to really study what we ended up with because, of course, it's just an animatic.
Every shot in it is a visual effects shot. There isn't one shot that isn't.
So we broke the scene down into all its component parts. We figured out which shots we needed Naomi for. So we had to think of ways in which we could shoot Naomi in this very complicated series of shots that we had to do. We built various rigs, harnesses that she wore.
And 3, 2, 1, action!
I would have Naomi, you know, looking like she's swinging off a vine, and I'd just swirl the camera around. At one stage, when she's on the head of the Tyrannosaurus, we made a very simple, big polystyrene head that she was able to grip onto, and we just simply had people who were moving and shaking the head around, and she was just holding on for dear life. And by that stage, Weta Workshop had built a miniature of the chasm.
He falls off that rock, but he's hanging by his claws, so it was quite conceivable that he could swing and land on this cliff when it was out here. So we pushed it back under to try and give the impression that there's no way if he swung he'd fall down here.
And Alex Funky and his miniature crew spent many, many weeks shooting all the different camera angles that were needed.
Well, the vine chasm itself is basically 2 gigantic stone walls. And then when were brought over here, we did all the final dressing, the painting, the dressing with the little fine vines and moss and so forth. So the walls looked wet and soggy and lots of stuff growing in the little cracks. And as we're shooting it, we're always talking to the guys at Digital to whom we're going to have to hand this material so that we can say, well, okay, here are the elements we're going to shoot. Here are the different lighting passes. Here are the different smoke passes. What do you need to make this final result that Peter wants to see?
We had to then add Kong and the dinosaurs, which is the domain of the digital department. They took sculptures of the dinosaurs that were done by Weta Workshop.
This is what we got here. This is Stan, the T-Rex, and this comes from Black Hills over in South Dakota. And this is, I believe it's one of the most completed skulls ever found of a T-Rex, and it's a beautiful specimen. And it was just a great reference for all the sculptors to have this kind of stuff to look at.
Each of the 3 T-Rexes is slightly different to each other. It's a family, it's a mother and a father and a child, and they sculpted those and they made maquettes that were then scanned in the computer.
We need to then take that data and convert that into a creature that's animatable, that can move naturally, that still preserves all that detail. And then the colour is layered in on top of that, all the different texture passes are created. I
wanted the dinosaurs to have a slightly old-fashioned look. I didn't want the smooth, pebbly skin that paleontologists tell us dinosaurs have today. I wanted the old 1930s movie-style dinosaurs, which they had scales and lumps and bumps on them and much more crocodilian. So we had freedom and to make them just like cool movie monsters, basically. Kong took a long time to work through, a very organic, creative process of designing Kong. All the detail that had to go into that is, vastly, vastly complicated to make him into a living, breathing digital gorilla. We spent the best part of 2 years, I would say, on working on his design and getting him to look like he does in the movie.
The vine sequence was one of the first sequences that we worked on, and it actually was the process for us to work out the character of Kong and get his look and really seeing him as a character for the first time.
We knew from Peter that he needed to look like he was old and, beat up, like he lived in this world alone, and it was a very dangerous, violent world. And, for him, fighting T-Rexes was not that out of the ordinary. I mean, that's how he survived.
We were able to animate with the very early form of Kong. What's interesting when the animation begins is you don't necessarily need your finished creatures. We had the animators start working even before we knew what the characters were going to finally look like. And so they animated their way through copying the previs, basically, and at times they enhanced and improved the dynamics. They spent more time on the animation than what was originally spent on the previs, which is always done very quickly.
After doing the previs, we had a nice little roadmap of the sequence and what each camera was supposed to be doing.
Kong is fighting one T-Rex, that's hard enough. When he's fighting 3 T-Rexes, the animation really becomes difficult because, you know, you're dealing with weight and balance of all these large creatures. You've got to portray that size, but you also have to have the, you know, the action that you would get in a big fight. As these creatures fall and get caught up in the vines, naturally the vines are snapping and breaking from the weight, and they're fighting, which is causing other vines to dislodge and rocks to come loose from the walls, and everything starting to fall in on itself. And that was a very difficult thing to choreograph.
I looked at cable bridges, because there's a few cool cable bridges on the outskirts of Wellington that you can sort of walk across, and you see the cables kind of moving and bouncing around, taking the weight. That was cool for vines. Having nightmares about vines, getting caught in them, getting wrapped in them.
And then, of course, in that sequence, the one other thing we have to do is a digital double for Anne, because there were a lot of stunts required of Anne that Naomi actually weren't able to do, just things that no one could physically perform.
We built a very, very realistic model of Naomi in the computer. We scanned her, and I tell you what, in some shots you really can't tell the difference.
That's working on new techniques for lighting and shading her face, for creating her hair, for simulating the cloth, doing the cloth soles for her clothing, for getting a really good facial animation performance, for creating her facial animation. So we're using new approaches for all of that stuff, just because of the demands of the scene.
I wanted to make sure that we had atmosphere and we had a feeling of depth. So we'd put the different layers together, and we'd put smoke, and we'd put falling leaves, because as the vines get disturbed and they fall down, I wanted bits of debris and leaves to flutter and fall to give it a very organic texture. It's very important to be as real as possible.
So our job is essentially to put all of those things together into a believable sort of environment, dialing in the atmosphere, sort of making it, getting that sort of misty, spooky Skull Island kind of vibe that Peter really wants to get out of the sequence.
And of course the final thing is sound effects and music. Our sound department had to work on the roar of the Tyrannosaurus, the roar of Kong, and you obviously want these great creaking, groaning sounds as the vines get stretched and they break and snap.
When I first saw it as a previous sequence, I just thought, wow, what a spectacular scene, what a spectacular opportunity for sound effects. So in this scene, we're using obviously different animals for the creature vocals, and then there's all the vines ripping out of the cliffs, and so we've been recording different root pulls and sounds like that are going into the vines swinging and slipping out of the cliffs.
And once that's all done, we're finished. We go home. Yeah. Yeah.
So that gives you some insight into what it takes to put a very complicated scene like this together. So it's a scene that was 2 years in the making, and we're very proud of it, and we'd love to show you a little bit of the finished result right now. So let's have a look at some of the vine sequence.
Adrien!